You snap to attention to a shocking realization. You are already outside the door to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. How could this happen? You have no recollection of walking here. It's almost as if the tape of your memory has suddenly been erased. But valiantly, you resolve to press on, diving into the pub's riotous conversation about arts and faith. At a corner table by the fire, the cool table, are three people debating whether rock and roll music really can help your houseplants grow. One of them is me, your co-host, Matt Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Rocky Mountain Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple thing, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To further this goal, we do all sorts of things. Each spring, we have our big Imagination Redeemed conference, which attracts folks from all across the country. We also have a regular slate of concerts, lectures, and other events designed to foster love and understanding of arts and faith. And we even have our own Guild of Artists right here in Colorado Springs. And when those of us in the Arts Guild aren't busy creating art, some of us like to podcast. And that's how we get Believe to See. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're there, you should check out Anselm's two other podcasts. And since you're already doing stuff, maybe rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That's a great way to help increase the visibility of the show, and that would help us out a lot. But, do whatever you want. I don't know. I can't tell you what to do. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an explanation to this episode. For this episode, we had a little bit of a technical snafu. The computer that records the episode, I'm convinced it hates me because midway through, actually a couple minutes in, it crashed, and the stuff we recorded using our fancy microphones was unusable. Fortunately, I had a backup recording just on my phone, so you can still hear it, and it's reasonably good audio quality, but the first couple minutes was cut off. So I just wanted to explain that and to sort of set the scene for what we're doing. Our co-host is Evangeline Denmark, who's an Anselm Society Arts Guild writer who's been on the show several times. And our guest is Mary Nikkel. She is the founder of Rock on Purpose, which is a website dedicated to rock on purpose. Why overthink this? But she's a rock journalist who has extensive experience covering especially Christian rock and roll, and she's done that for a number of big outlets through the years, which she will talk about. But she has some really interesting ideas on the purpose of rock and roll, and especially this sort of niche Christian rock and roll area. So that part that we missed is basically some quick introductions, and when we hop in, we are hopping in at a moment when Evangeline explains how she met Mary Nikkel and her family. So without any further ado, let's hop into this episode on Mary Nikkel and Christian rock.
Know what was going on, but I was there to help, and I think fed them and enjoyed their company, and that was how I first got introduced to her family, which is quite a large family. 7?
Yes, 7 kids.
7 kids. And I have also met her mom, and we have had many wonderful conversations. She's a writer as well. And I have followed Mary online as sort of this secret fan.
Oh.
For many years. Mary's writing is incredible. Do you call yourself a music journalist, or what is?
I have yet to find a good term, because
Okay.
usually if I start describing it, it gets really long. I say freelance writer generally, but what that encompasses is music journalism largely. So
Okay. So she's a photographer, an amazing writer, talks about music, talks about art, talks about faith, talks about mental health in just a really beautiful, authentic, and honest way. And so I have just been kind of a cheerleader in the background. And us Anselm folks, we kind of meet people and sort of want to bring them in. We're like, okay, you're one of us. You're one of us. Even though you live in Tennessee, you're one of us.
You didn't know it, but
right.
we already,
yeah, but you have been.
In the club. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're part of the family. So I wanted to have her on the podcast and kind of talk about music and all the things that she talks about wonderfully.
Yeah, so what's a good way to kick this off? I'm not used to just going without notes, but let me ask you this. So, when did this all start? And I'm talking about like the rockumentary writer. Rockumentary, that's a thing, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I'll own
So, you grew up, now, missionary background in there, I believe?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so you're growing up as a missionary kid. When did this passion for rock start?
So that was really something that started in my teenage years because I grew up, again, I come from a missionary background. Both my parents grew up on the mission field. We served, my parents brought my whole family out to the mission field when I was a kid. We lived in Africa for a year and a half. That was kind of the context I was in, and it was a very, very traditional kind of like strain of Christianity. So rock music was nowhere in my childhood whatsoever, aside from my dad, who is German. He loved like ABBA and the Beatles and a lot of like that kind of stuff from across the pond, but he like would play it secretively. So that was kind of like my early, because it was not entirely like acceptable in the kind of the social circles we were in.
Oh my.
But as a teenager, I discovered the internet, and when that's
an important thing.
It was a very important thing. I wouldn't be sitting here otherwise, because again, it's how I know Evangeline ultimately. But as a teenager, I kind of went through a lot of really difficult. I had depression struggles, and I went through a time where I was suicidal, and that's a huge part of what I talk about when I'm talking about music, because music met me in the middle of that and was really a kind of a place of solace and safety, and ultimately ended up being a huge part of how I encountered God. And in the process of doing that, because rock music was the music that felt really true to where I was, that felt really true to my experience, and that really kind of incarnated Christ in my life in a really real way. I was like, how do I help other people who are hurting experience that same thing? And I had no clue how to do that for the longest time, but I just kept showing up at concerts to start with at about 16, 17, and saying, I just want to do whatever I can to be around this thing that is so full of life.
Okay, so let's get a couple preliminaries that popped into my head as you were talking. First, so your dad is German, he's a big Beatles fan. What did German people call the Beatles? Is it Das Beatles, or is there something better?
He literally just called them the Beatles. That was like,
that's not what I was hoping
it's
for.
really unfortunate that was just what they went with, but it's also because almost anybody who grew up in Germany is far more likely to be bilingual. It's a classic thing where Americans usually speak one language. That is not true. My dad grew up speaking two, so.
Okay. So
I love ABBA too. I'm just gonna put it out.
I am still. I can throw down to that.
Right. And aside, I love ABBA.
Okay, so were the Beatles and ABBA your first rock loves, or did you discover something else that was your first taste of rock?
So the Beatles and ABBA would have been my first loves in terms of the first ones I heard and enjoyed, though also feeling like I shouldn't exactly be enjoying them. But, my dad was listening to them, so there was some level of permission. All of us
listeners are nodding along like, yeah, I know that one.
The first band that I can remember that I really discovered as being my own was Queen. And the introduction to that is completely absurd, but my older brother and I found Lord of the Rings fan vids online, and they were set to Queen songs.
Oh my gosh, this must be seen.
They still exist. If you search YouTube, there are some of these old videos from 2005 that have been immortalized there.
LOTR and Queen.
For some reason, and now in retrospect it's really weird, but at the time it wasn't. It was just, we were like, this is the coolest thing we've ever heard. And Aragorn is being set to this music, so clearly it's good. So that was kind of weirdly how I really kind of started making it my own.
Okay, so Queen. I have this theory that the first bands that you really grab onto, whether they're your idea or their parents' idea, they sort of meld your music taste for the rest of your life. My dad was a huge Eagles fan growing up.
Oh, nice.
No.
And my mom hated the Eagles. So I have these very distinct memories of being on road trips and Peaceful Easy Feeling Comes or Hotel California, and my dad's just grooving to it, and I was like, this is inappropriate. Do you know where Hotel California takes place? That woman is a prostitute. And I was listening to it, and I was like, oh, yeah, you're probably right. I didn't think of it, but yeah, but so Eagles for me. Evangeline, do you have a similar thing?
Hate the Eagles. Corey loves the Eagles. We go around and around, and
so
it's not fair. So
your kids are gonna be me someday.
My kids, you want to talk about music stuff? I don't even know. Some of the stuff they listen to, I'm like, yeah, I've been listening to that band or that person for years. Other ones I'm like, what the heck is this? But no, for me, I have to say, I grew up with a little bit of kind of like Christian rock at the time, Amy Grant. I remember listening to DC Talk. You mentioned DC Talk. So there was a little bit of that. The band from my teen years, though, is U2. I mean, seminal for me. I mean, I think that they formed my music taste. The Joshua Tree is the best album. I'm just going to put it out there all time. But the Cranberries, Pearl Jam, R.E.M., all the grunge stuff, that was my stuff because I was a teen in the 90s. And yeah, as far as I'm concerned, we could just continue with those bands. We'd be fine.
So, Mary, you're talking about going to your first concerts. I'm very interested in your chronology here. So, sounds like your first couple concerts, you're feeling kind of guilty. You like it, but you feel like you shouldn't be liking it. Do you have like a turning point where you start to think, maybe it's okay that I like that?
I think a big part of it was when I started seeing it impacting the people around me. Because the first concerts I went to, I mean, literally the first one I ever went to, I snuck out of the house to buy Skillet tickets when I was 17. So that was like legitimately like it felt very forbidden, but at the same time I really enjoyed it. But then again, felt the sense of guilt, like should I be doing this? But then over the next year, as I started seeing more bands and started going with other people, I think it was one thing when it was like, well, this is impacting my life in a way, but is that right or wrong? But then to me, seeing the impact on other people around me and seeing them respond to it started to be like, there's something to this. If it's not just me, if it's people who I really love and care about, who are finding something meaningful here, then there's probably like something to it that's true and beautiful and not wrong. So that was really, and that was, again, that would have been when I was like 18-ish, that I started being like, okay, I think I'm pretty much all in on this as something that's important.
Pretty sure it's not sinning. Looks to her left, looks to her right. Not sin. Okay, here we go.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's take the next step here where we're now at the stage, for those keeping track at home, where you've decided that that's a good thing to do. When do you decide to start writing about and getting super into it?
Yeah, so some of that was borderline chance. What I tell people a lot when they ask, how do you even go from just being someone who listens to somebody who's doing it, engaging with it professionally, I just showed up all the time. And part of showing up was that I followed a lot of music websites. I started just on my own taking pictures of bands, and then eventually, because I was just paying a lot of attention, a website that I followed put out a call saying we need some volunteer contributing writers, and I was 19 at the time and in college. So I sent an email in, and they were like, okay, we want to see some samples of your writing. So I had written a few reviews of albums on my blog, and so I just sent those to them, and they read them, and they were like, how would you like to develop a whole new column for us? So it went from I had just been personal blogging to they were like, we're giving you this platform. And then pretty quickly I said I could take photos as well, and they weren't really sure if that was true, so I just sent them one day, and they were like, okay, you can take photos. So after that, it ended up being this really unique thing where I almost made my job with that website, who I ended up working for the next 7.5 years.
Wow.
And during that time, they grew to be the biggest Christian music website in the world, and I ended up eventually becoming the associate editor and managing a team of about 15 other writers.
Wow, so can't see a pitch possibly going better than that.
Pretty much. It felt like it was a charmed thing, to be honest.
Well, there's something to be said for showing up and for the passion and for continuing to pursue it. I was just having a conversation with one of my kids the other day about the arts and making a career in the arts, and I told him, you have to love it more than the amount of pain that it causes you.
Absolutely.
It has to be worth your time, and it almost has to be an obsession.
Yes.
If you're going to do this, because otherwise it's not going to happen, and you should go to school for engineering.
Yeah, so something that caught me there. So this is one of the bigger Christian rock sites.
Yeah, so the site that I worked for 7.5 years was the biggest, and I was with them until last year, which was the point at which I branched out on my own. But yeah, they had a very, very significant presence.
So are we talking folks who write about Christian rock or rock writers who are Christians? Because I think in this case, adjective placement is very important.
Absolutely. that website, it was fully Christian market.
Okay.
And they covered all different genres. When I was brought on, I was doing a lot in all different genres. They cover worship, they cover pop, hip hop, everything. But it became really clear early on that I had a particular niche with rock. So I became really the champion of rock in the broader conversation about Christian market music. And it was a lot about the experience of being really particularly in the Christian market that ended up shaping both, what I did want to do and what I didn't want to do. Like, it really refined for me where my actual place was. Like, growing up really from being a 19-year-old college kid to a professional adult in that setting was really, really formative.
And this whole area is what I would like to sort of make camp on for a while, because I grew up with a lot of the Christian rock, so I'll tell you the bands I listened to, and everyone at home can guess exactly how old I am. And I'm talking like DC Talk, Newsboys, Audio Adrenaline, Reliant K, this whole milieu. So what is going on when you start writing about it? Like, who are the new it bands?
Oh, I'm just trying to track back. This would have been 8 years ago now. 8 years ago. Well, here's in my early years doing this, and I also actually interned at a record label for a while at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so I was in meetings when they were developing Lauren Daigle as an artist.
Oh, wow.
And For King and Country was another one who very early in my time working in the Christian music industry, I went out and covered their very first tour, which was Winter Jam in 2012, and then they completely blew up. So those were the kind of artists that at the time were kind of new and rising. But at the time, rock was really, there were not many new voices, like 7-8 years ago. I would say that there's more now than there were then, because that was when rock was going into a bit of a recession, if you will.
I've heard rumors about rock's early demise, but I think those are exaggerated.
I would agree.
You looked worried for a sec, so don't worry.
Yeah.
I think we're okay.
I was like, which direction are we going?
So, Evangeline, did you have Christian go-to rock bands back in the day?
I do remember going to Newsboys concerts, and you are younger than me, so I'm not sure where we go with that. But
picture me as a precocious, pimple-faced 13-year-old.
Right.
Like, so this is music.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So I remember going to Newsboys concerts. I think I did see DC Talk, but I can't. Maybe at Red Rocks, which should be memorable.
I think you'd remember that.
Yeah, that does sound pretty legendary.
If it's real, who knows? I don't know. My memory has been shot by children. Who else? Like I said, Amy Grant when I was really young. And then there was this time around 15, 16 that I sort of went, let's call it secular.
Oh, you made the jump.
I made the jump, and I haven't really much looked back. I'm sorry, Mary.
No, and I understand, because that's part of the big transition that happened for me, was in the process, because rock is a genre that has by necessity, because the Christian market pretty much decided that it wasn't profitable for it anymore. That was a big part of kind of the transition I've been in the past few years, is the same transition that a lot of rock bands have been in, where they've realized, people who are really, really devout in their spirituality have realized, maybe we need to just be making music, and anybody who wants to come to the table can come, because we're not on the inside of these rooms anymore of the industry. And so what do we have to lose? Let's just make the stuff we care about. And so where I've landed now is trying to partner with them in that and kind of doing the same thing.
I think I happened to see a random post that you were talking about stumbling across 21 Pilots at a festival before they were huge. And I had no idea that they had roots in, Christian industry or anything like that.
Yeah.
All I know of them is, 21 Pilots.
Oh, I know.
Radio and huge,
And that is where they started. They really tried to make a name for themselves in the Christian industry. The first time I saw them was summer of 2011, and they were in they'd been shoved to a little side tent at this Christian festival in Kentucky. And
can't even imagine it.
It was, there were about 30 people in the audience, and they were giving it their absolute all. And I remember just walking in there, and I had been around their drummer before because he played in another Christian band, so I stopped by to watch and see what he was doing, and I thought, this band is phenomenal, but they will never make it anywhere in the Christian market. And that was correct. The Christian market didn't know what to do with them. But the second that they actually got to a place where they had kind of an in the mainstream market, they completely blew up. But there's still, there are people of faith that they have, and you hear that in their music, but they just make good music.
So I have a plan. I would like to work up to this question of why they wouldn't work in the Christian market. But to do that, I'm going to leave it on the table. It's tantalizing.
But I want to talk about it now.
And we'll start backwards. So, as I am sure you are aware, the sort of contemporary Christian music scene gets criticized from a lot of directions. So, I'll give some of the more popular ones. It's like, okay, well, it's basically like parasitic of secular music. It's like not as good versions of secular music where they talk about Jesus instead of people, so that there's that. And then there's all these like little Christianese boxes they need to do to appeal to the market. I'm sure there's other ones you can throw in as well. But in your experience, how does this look in practice when you're not just sort of some pimple-faced 13-year-old, but you're actually in the world?
One of the things that I tell people a lot is that it's really important to differentiate between the industry as such and the actual artists. Because in my experience, a lot of the people who are making music that those kinds of criticisms are leveled against, the people themselves are really, really well-intentioned, beautiful people. And I know a lot of them, and I love and respect a lot of them. And I really don't regret any time I've spent around them. But there's the industry machine that I think a lot of those criticisms are much, much more true of kind of the conversations that are happening in offices at record labels, more than the actual people making the art who are kind of, for one reason or another, in the system and trying to do their level best to still kind of like live in that tension of, here we have like a really good intention that we want to do, but then we're like trying to do it within a system that is kind of boxing that up and making it happen in really, really narrow channels. And so I think that was part of what was sometimes challenging about being behind the curtain, was seeing that tension that artists were living in and feeling frustration on their behalf at times. And a lot of them, again, they're choosing to be there, and I have a lot of respect for that. But the reality is, it is a business. And any time when you have this situation where there's like a thing that a very particular audience wants, there's a demand, and the business's job is to supply that demand. And there's an automatic thing that's going to happen there where there's going to be, the art is going to be transactional, and the art is going to be processed to deliver the product that people want. And people do want it. And that's another thing that I think people forget, is a market for it, or else it wouldn't exist. But I'm not the market for it. And there are, I think, increasingly, especially like people in my generation, increasingly we are not the market for it.
Honestly, if you're a sort of person listening to this podcast, you're probably not the market for it, if I had to guess.
Yeah, I would expect the same from what I know of the Anselm family.
I was going to say, that sounds so familiar from my time in Christian publishing, is, the authors, genuine, wonderful people, want to craft art, don't want to just produce a product. The editors and the agents, the same way, but there is that marketing piece. There's that end result, and that, and we like to trash on and dig on the, the whole Amish romance or whatever it is today that's like the thing. But there should be that product for the people who want it. It's just, the sad truth is that there isn't enough room, it seems, for there to be all the products for the people who want something else.
Yeah, and part of it is just because of the nature of this, where it is, it's Christian music. It seems like when it gets sort of commoditized, it looks a little grosser, because it looks it's way easier to take a slightly cynical outlook toward it. So I'm thinking toward, I remember when I was a kid, I got this little like pamphlet from my local Christian bookstore, may it rest in peace. And it was basically like, well, if you like this secular band, you should try this Christian band.
Classic.
It's almost as good and a lot more Christian. And it doesn't, hey, you want a band that plays kind of cool music but no swear words? Well, try this one. So there was that angle, and also the angle where you'd see the band where they get a little following in the Christian realm, then they have this song that's just general enough and it's super good. We're like, hey guys, we can get some secular play. You remember when POD had one? It was like, hey, I heard that one. Or like Reliant K had one.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, you can look at that a lot of different ways. But Mary, how did you look at that sort of stuff?
Well, I think a lot of it, the kind of scenarios surrounding it, I started to like pay a lot of attention to saying, why exactly was this done? Because situations where, like, say a band like POD, where they were crossing over, I think it was really legitimate. But then there were other cases where, once again, the people in suits were making those decisions, where it was like, we intentionally want to make a version of a mainstream band, or we want this Christian band to make a song that is a version of what the mainstream market is playing, so that it can actually like cross over. And that still happens all the time. Uh-huh. But there is definitely, like, saying it's grosser is a good way to say it, because it's kind of then, it's like the thing that I go back to is with Christian music, it's just so difficult because, like, the stakes are so high. Like, no one's really going to care if it's a pop song that's like a love song and that the record label made the artist write it. Like, no one's really going to care. But when it's about, like, the things that matter most, like literal, like eternal things, like that, suddenly the stakes are so much higher. Yeah. So when you have a scenario where you have people in suits in a boardroom saying, okay, we have to write worship music because right now that's what sells. Well, the entire point of worship music is supposed to be, like, lived towards God. But then the actual, like, root of that worship music has become, it's going to sell. So by default, you short-circuited the entire purpose of the music. So it's very, very awkward. And it's really, really difficult, I think, for artists to live in that tension. And a lot of them, again, I think, I keep going back to the artists are really well-intentioned. Like, they really are. Believe me, guys. Like, so yeah, I do a lot of looking at why. Like, why was this decision made? Like, when I was trying to navigate, especially when I was interacting with a lot of the really, really CCM bands, if you will. I was looking at...
Really CCM? Partially CCM, there's, like, fully CCM.
Yeah, well,
like,
you're...
super CCM.
There's, like, Audio A and Newsboys, which, okay, they're kind of... They're like, rock-ish, but then you've got Casting Crowns. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, yes, that helped.
There's like
I know
levels
exactly what
here.
You're talking about.
Yeah. So, and it's when I was, again, in that world where it was completely like bands who have no crossover ability whatsoever.
Yeah.
A lot of that was really, really well intentioned, and some of it was not from the people behind it. So a lot of it was me looking at what sense can I get on the pulse of why this is being done, because I think the why sometimes matters as much or more than the what.
Mm-hmm. That is so interesting because, like going back to some of those examples. So POD's first crossover, at least the one I remember, was that I feel so alive for the very first. And I remember hearing it for like the X Games intro. And like, what, did I like a cool band before it was cool? This has never happened before. So you can kind of picture it one of two ways, right? You can picture it like POD writes this song. You can totally see how a Christian could write this with a Christian intention, then they discover this later on. Oh, feels so alive, like doing a cool half pipe in X Games, and that's cool. Or you can also picture it like the little record label suit coming in, like, guys, let's sort of buff out the edges here, make it a little more general. We'll sort of send it ESPN's way. This is an impossible question I'm going to ask you, but I'll ask it anyway. Which of those two scenarios do you think happens more often for these crossover songs?
The second one. If the band's on a record label, I would say the second one. If the band's independent, then that's a whole other ballgame. And a lot of rock and roll is independent right now, which is another huge shift that happened in the time that I've worked in the music industry. Is initially all bands were pretty much, you got any traction, were on a record label. That is not true now. Most rock bands are independent. But if they are on a label, especially in the early 2000s, there was a lot of that happening, where it was like, how do we de-Jesus it just enough?
You leave enough Jesus in so that the religious people like it, but we take out it.
Absolutely.
Oh, so gross.
It was a delicate and awkward marketing tactic. And they had it down to a science for a while. I feel especially in the early 2000s, that was like the era where that was happening.
Yeah. We're like, hey, I'm begging you to be my escape. Yeah, okay, yeah. You can see how that toes the line.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Okay, so that's, I think, the first step in our journey to why these bands just can't make it in the Christian market. So are there really two tracks then of CCM? There's the CCM that could cross over, the sort of like Lion Stylers, and the ones who are just like deep CCM. Sort of like Deep South, Deep Boston, there's Deep CCM. Does that exist, or am I a little off base there?
So part of this question is it's been different 10 years ago to what it is now.
Yeah.
Right now, what has been happening over the past few years is that a lot of the middle ground has disappeared to where now pretty much the only two tracks that do exist now for a band is to be straight on worship, like completely like we could be playing this corporately in a church somewhere, or crossover. That middle ground where it used to be like
the DC Talk area.
The DC Talk, that kind of thing, that has pretty much disappeared. And I think it's largely because of the disillusionment factor that happened. And I think it's also because a lot of artists reaching a point where they really want to be one or the other.
Yeah.
Because as much as it's true that a lot of those crossover songs might have been something that an executive somewhere was saying, let's make this palatable to both, a lot of artists
reverse engineer this in a laboratory. Yeah.
A lot of artists, I think, eventually, like, they really just want to make music. And again, they don't want to necessarily think about the marketing terms, because a lot of the times Christian music is a marketing term.
Yeah.
Because it refers to where something is going to be stocked, like what stores it's going to be in, where it's going to be advertised, things like that. So by default, I think that kind of push and pull has resulted in this divergence where now you have music that's for corporate religious use, which there's always going to be a need for. In one way or another, there will always be a market for that, which is why it's selling right now. And then you have the bands who are just making music, and it's crossover music at that point. And rock right now pretty much only exists as crossover music. I can think of like maybe 2 or 3 bands who are exceptions, and that's it. Almost every rock band I know right now has singles on both the Christian rock charts and the mainstream rock charts, because at this point in time, rock in particular has been a genre that really was the forefront of that, but hip-hop is the same now. Pop is a little bit harder, but even like I mentioned for King and Country earlier, they were pretty much a solid Christian pop band to begin with, and now they've had multiple mainstream hits. Because they were either going to go worship or they had to become crossover, because that's pretty much the only spaces that really exist anymore.
Okay, so I'm going to reveal to you now how I'm probably lame and old. I'm trying to picture in my mind the contours of a crossover band. So let's say I've decided to become cool again. I've started a band and I want to be a crossover band. What are the characteristics that make up a crossover band?
So a lot of that is, every band is a little bit different. But to a large extent, what's usually going to happen is crossover bands are going to write about what we call positive themes. And positive is almost like a meaningless word, so I have to define that really. But what it means is like that they're talking about things like the idea of hope, or the idea that people matter, or the idea that maybe the injustice in the world matters, like that kind of thing, where the trajectory of their music and their lyrics is towards things that are underneath the surface and things that matter on like a long-term level. So they're singing about those things, but not necessarily with strictly religious terms attached to it. And sometimes these bands do not, not all the members are actually religious in any way. Usually, if it's a crossover band, at least the main lyricist is. But often now, especially, there are rock bands where some of the members might be professing Christians, but not all of them. But all of them have a shared belief in, again, ideas like that people matter, and that there's something to be said for the idea of redemption and healing and things like that. So that's kind of how crossover bands are now. And there are a few of these bands that are like huge. And there are some that are crossover bands that are a lot more direct in how they talk about things. Like there was a huge metal band a few years ago called For Today, who disbanded about 2 years back now, if I'm remembering correctly. But they were like literally preaching like an evangelistic pitch at Warped Tour. And somehow it worked. And they were out playing with bands who had really satanic imagery in their music, and then they're opening with like this like straight like screamed theology, 5-minute tracks, and somehow it worked. So, and I think part of it is that rock and roll is by default is the genre of the outcast. And for that reason, a lot of ideological variance is accepted where it might not be elsewhere. And that has kind of allowed the crossover artist to be a thing in that genre more than anywhere else, I think.
I need to find that genre in books. Where are the outcasts so that I can go and be real? I feel like I hate to bring up the catchword authenticity, but it does feel like that has probably been a huge factor in these bands that are now thriving, because when you were talking about like the fundamental beliefs that, redemption is a thing that you can get, or that people matter and justice matters. To me, that's like, oh, that's real. That's a fundamental thing that you can kind of build on and be real about it and be authentic about it. But I imagine that had to be I know for me in my own journey as an artist, it was painful to get to the place where I knew that this was what I wanted to talk about. Mm-hmm. And that meant that I may not add faith elements, because when I would add faith elements, it did not feel authentic. It did not feel real. It felt like I was adding Bible verses, So it had to have been, for some of these bands, a painful thing, because I'm sure that that's what they always wanted, was to be that, and they were kind of pushed in this direction. Who has weathered that well? Who do you think has really built a foundation of, again, to use the catchphrase, authenticity, genuineness?
Who's manufactured authenticity the best?
I mean, Switchfoot is the one that everybody always says. Okay. But that's legitimate. There's a reason for that. Like, Switchfoot, I think a lot of people have over the years kind of suggested to me, like, they can't be real. They can't actually mean what they're doing. Like, no, they really, really do. Switchfoot has historically had basically an equal following in both the mainstream market and the Christian market. And it's in part because they are just 100% authentic. They're not going to write a song that they don't believe in. And that's led to stuff that has resonated with everybody because it's very human. So they've really been kind of the torchbearer for kind of like a whole modern movement of bands who are striving for authenticity. Mm-hmm. Like almost like so many bands will list Switchfoot as their inspiration. And there's a reason for that. It's kind of like U2 is the same way. You referenced earlier, even before Switchfoot, there was, U2 was a model for a lot of bands who are like, we want to talk about things that matter, but we don't want to superimpose Bible verses that don't feel authentic to what we're doing.
Right.
So Switchfoot is a major one. There's, on the harder side, there's a band called Memphis Mayfire that has done this extremely well. And they've really risen like astronomically in the past 5 years. I would even say 21 Pilots, if we're going to go back and talk about them. They are extremely authentic in talking about mental health, but also talking about those broad themes of hope. Like, their whole, like, their past 2 records have really been concept records that in some way or another talk about finding identity or finding your way out of the dark. And they have done that in a very genuine way, and it's resonated with people. And I think that's, in a way, it should be encouraging to people that you can be authentic, and maybe there's like a market that's going to think, oh, we can't actually sell that. But there are going to be people out there who it matters to them.
Who eat it up.
Yes.
I like to think of it as kind of that, like in all art, that Me Too factor, and I don't mean the movement, but that when we hold up our art to the world, we're hoping that we get the response of, Me Too, that's how I feel. And when you see that as an artist, when someone comes back at you with, I know exactly how that feels, I really, resonated with that. It's so powerful. It's so, like, I just, it makes me want to I'll do this all day for you if it, connects. And then to be in an audience and see people around you respond, you were talking about watching the people around you and how that impacted you. It really, you can't manufacture someone else's response, and you look at the person in the, crowd next to you and you see them like crying or responding, and it's so powerful that, I would think that it's my driving force, when I can, when I can get there. And I would think that would be the driving force of any band.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You hear over and over and over again, bands are like, when I feel like I can't do this, what keeps me going is looking out at a crowd and seeing people singing along. Yeah. They're like, those are the moments when it's worth it, when these words that I wrote that felt genuine are words that other people are singing back to me because they feel genuine to their experience too. And that really has been one reason why the Christian rock community, and then later for me the whole broader rock community, became such a safe space, because I felt like I was encountering so many people who weren't afraid to share their experiences and also weren't afraid to turn around to somebody sharing their experiences and say, me too. And it's been really rewarding to venture out into a space for me where I'm writing about all rock music as a whole, which is what I'm doing right now, and finding how many people resonate with that and how many people are saying, I found something meaningful in these songs, whether or not it was strictly in a traditional religious sense. There's just so much potential for resonance there.
I wanted you to talk about I'm sorry, I've like hijacked it from that.
Oh, it's okay.
I wanted you to talk about Rock on Purpose, your new site, and like the thought behind it, your goal for it.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it.
So when a year ago, the website that I'd written for 7.5 years went through a huge transition because the entire music industry is transitioning, and they let their whole staff go. So I was really, really quickly unmoored, and I was in a life transition, and then I was in a career transition, and I was trying to figure out where's my place in the music industry, because I'd gotten really burned out on a lot of the Christian market things where I was seeing, a lack of authenticity, if we're going to keep going back to that word. So I was like, it's legitimate. Like, it's the conversation. So I started asking myself, what would it look like to just write about what I want to write about?